Tonight, we're going back to a time when humans were only trying to survive and accidentally set the stage for a global bias. Before you settle in, feel free to like the video and subscribe if you genuinely enjoy these stories. And let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see how far this moment travels. Now, dim the lights and ease into this journey with me. In the deep prehistoric past, long before language, before culture, before anyone argued about the right way to do things, human hands had no preference at all. There was no dominant hand, no favorite, no quiet realization that one hand does all the work while the other mostly exists for balance and moral support. Early humans lived in a world that rewarded flexibility, not preference. Survival didn't care which hand you liked more. It only cared whether you could grab food, climb out of danger, and avoid falling over at the worst possible moment. Hands were interchangeable tools, like two equally unreliable coworkers who might both fail you at any time. If something needed grabbing, you used whichever hand was closer. If you tripped, you flailed with both. If a predator appeared, you didn't think, yes, my dominant side. You thought, move, now. And both hands agreed immediately. At this stage, symmetry mattered. Climbing trees required balance. Carrying food required even weight. Running from danger demanded arms, swinging, in something resembling coordination. Favoring one hand too much would have been inefficient, like insisting on hopping on one foot, because it felt more authentic. Tools were simple. Stones were picked up, not shaped. Sticks were used until they snapped, then discarded without ceremony. There was no craftsmanship, no technique, no moment where someone suggested switching hand for better results. Precision hadn't entered the conversation yet. Injuries were common, and medicine didn't exist. If you hurt one hand and couldn't switch to the other, that was unfortunate. If you hurt one hand and could adapt, congratulations. You got to keep existing. Natural selection quietly applauded adaptability and moved on. Children grew up copying whatever worked. Adults used both hands because both hands worked. No one corrected anyone. No one cared. There were no rules, no instruction manuals, no prehistoric forum debates about whether one hand was morally superior. Handedness didn't exist because it served no purpose. Nature hadn't been given a reason to choose. Balance was safer than specialization. Generalists survived longer than specialists in a chaotic world where everything wanted to kill you or steal your food. But that calm, symmetrical phase wouldn't last because the moment humans stopped holding tools and started making them, the body would be forced to pick a side, and one hand would quietly begin to do more work than the other. Symmetry was nice while it lasted. Two equal hands, no favorites, no pressure. Unfortunately, humans had a habit of ruining perfectly balanced situations by inventing things. And the moment our ancestors decided to make tools instead of just grabbing whatever stick was lying around, that peaceful agreement between the hands ended immediately. Early stone tools were not forgiving. You didn't gently shape a rock into a blade. You struck it hard with precision. One bad hit didn't just ruin the tool. It sent sharp flakes flying toward your fingers, which at this point in history were very important to keep attached. Suddenly, how you struck mattered a lot. At first, people experimented. Left hand, right hand, whatever felt okay that day. But something strange happened. Using the same hand again and again made the process smoother. The strike landed where expected. The angle improved. The flake broke cleanly. Mistakes happened less often. Blood loss decreased. This was considered a major success. The brain noticed. Repeating the same motion built something powerful. Muscle memory. The body stopped guessing. Movements became automatic. And once a motion became automatic, switching hands felt wrong. Like trying to write your name with your elbow. You could do it. But why would you willingly choose chaos? Tool making rewarded consistency, not creativity. The most successful tool makers weren't the ones switching hands for fun. They were the ones doing the same movement hundreds of times without thinking about it. Precision beat novelty. Survival beat variety. And here's the important part. Other people noticed. Humans learn by watching. When someone made a good tool, others copied not just the tool, but the movements, the stance, the grip, the hand. Children copied adults. Adults copied whoever didn't cut themselves. Slowly, one hand started doing most of the work. Not because it was better by design, but because it got better through repetition. The other hand didn't disappear. It assisted, stabilized, held the stone steady, and quietly accepted its supporting role. This wasn't a decision. There was no meeting, no announcement, no prehistoric pamphlet explaining the benefits of hand preference. It was just the body doing what bodies do best, choosing the option that wastes less energy and spills less blood. Symmetry had been useful, but efficiency had arrived. Once early humans began repeating the same movements over and over, the body adapted and the brain, never one to miss an opportunity to optimize, quietly took control. Brains love efficiency. If they could wear a tiny accountant's visor, they would. And once one hand started doing most of the fine work, the brain began rearranging itself to support that decision. The brain is not symmetrical in how it works, even if it looks that way from the outside. Different tasks settle into different regions, and once a task finds a home, it tends to stay there. Repetitive tool making, careful striking, and precise manipulation demanded planning, timing, and control. These tasks began clustering on one side of the brain because scattering them everywhere would have been a logistical nightmare. As this specialization grew, the hand connected to that side became faster, steadier, and more reliable. The other hand didn't get worse. It just didn't get promoted. It became the assistant, the stabilizer, the one holding the stone while the important hand did the dangerous work. Office politics existed long before offices. Switching hands now felt inefficient. Movements that once worked equally well suddenly felt clumsy on one side. The brain had invested time and energy into one pathway, and it wasn't interested in funding a second one unless absolutely necessary. This didn't mean early humans couldn't use both hands. They could. They often had to. But when precision mattered, when one mistake could slice skin or waste hours of effort, the preferred hand took over. The brain had decided which side got the delicate tasks. Children growing up in this environment absorbed the pattern without realizing it. They watched adults shaping tools with one hand and copying those movements, not because anyone told them to, but because copying success felt safer than improvisation. If everyone around you used the same hand to strike stone, trying the opposite felt like deliberately choosing the harder path. Over generations, this preference began appearing earlier in life. The brain wasn't born biased yet, but it was becoming more likely to settle into the same pattern. What started as habit slowly edged toward biology. There was no grand plan behind this, just quiet neurological bookkeeping. The brain looked at what worked, doubled down on it, and ignored the side that didn't complain. One hand had become the specialist. The other became support staff, and the brain approved this arrangement without asking either hand how it felt about it. Once the brain picked a favorite, the body followed without argument. Muscles are loyal like that. Give them a job, repeat it often enough, and they'll do it automatically. No questions asked, no feedback forms submitted. This is muscle memory, and prehistoric humans lean on it heavily, mostly because thinking too much while hitting rocks was a great way to lose fingers. Repetition turned movement into instinct. The preferred hand struck stone again and again, learning the exact angle, force, and timing needed to split flakes cleanly. The body stopped hesitating. The arm moved before the mind finished the thought. This was efficient. This was safe. This was the closest thing early humans had to mastery. The other hand, meanwhile, found its calling as support. It held the core stone steady. It adjusted grip. It braced. It did important work, just not glamorous work. Every operation needs someone holding things in place, and that role was filled quietly without applause. At this point, switching hands became deeply uncomfortable. Not impossible, just wrong. Using the non-preferred hand to strike felt like trying to walk with someone else's legs. The movement was technically possible, but nothing lined up properly. Timing was off. Force was inconsistent. Results were disappointing. Blood loss risk increased. The body noticed. Muscle memory didn't care about fairness. It cared about outcomes. The hand that succeeded kept getting better. The hand that hesitated stayed behind. Over time, the gap widened. What started as a mild preference hardened into a default setting. Daily life reinforced this constantly. Cutting meat, scraping hides, carving wood. Every task repeated the same motion. Each repetition strengthened neural pathways and muscle coordination. The body slowly stopped treating both hands as equals and started treating them as a team with assigned roles. Children learned this without instruction. They copied adults, and their muscles learned what adult muscles already knew. If the adults used one hand to strike, children practiced that hand more often. Practice built familiarity. Familiarity built preference. Preference built habit. And once a habit becomes automatic, questioning it stops making sense. No one asked, "Should I use my other hand today?" The body had already answered that question hundreds of times. The answer was always the same. By now, handedness wasn't just a choice. It was embedded in movement itself. The body had decided long before the mind ever noticed. By the time muscle memory had taken over, handedness was no longer just an individual habit. It had quietly become a social one. Early humans didn't learn from instruction manuals or helpful diagrams. They learned by watching. And humans are excellent imitators. Sometimes to our benefit, sometimes to our downfall. When someone in the group made good tools, everyone noticed. Not because they wanted to compliment them, but because good tools meant better hunting, cleaner cuts, and fewer injuries. If you wanted to survive, you copied the person who wasn't bleeding. And copying didn't stop at the tool itself. People copied the stance, the grip, the rhythm, and most importantly, the hand. If the best toolmaker used one hand, trying to use the other felt like deliberately choosing the wrong answer on a test, where the punishment was sharp stone fragments. Children absorbed this pattern without anyone explaining it. They watched adults work and mirrored them instinctively. Not because they understood efficiency, but because imitation felt safe. Doing things the normal way reduced mistakes. Doing things differently invited attention, and attention was rarely good in a prehistoric camp. Over time, a subtle feedback loop formed. Most adults used one hand. Children copied that hand. Those children grew up and became the adults others copied. No one enforced the pattern. No one punished deviation. It simply became the path of least resistance. And humans love the path of least resistance. This social copying had powerful effects. It smoothed cooperation. When everyone worked the same way, teaching became easier. Demonstrations made sense. Movements matched. Confusion dropped. Group efficiency increased without anyone ever having to discuss it around the fire. Even mistakes reinforced the pattern. If someone tried using the opposite hand and struggled, the group quietly filed that away as not ideal. No ridicule was needed. Reality handled the lesson. The person either adapted or switched back. Importantly, this didn't erase left-handed individuals. Some people still favor the opposite hand, but now they stood out slightly. Not as wrong, not as bad, just different. And difference in a survival-focused group carried subtle costs. It slowed learning. It made imitation harder. It required explanation. Most people avoided that friction by doing what everyone else did. So handedness stopped being just about bodies and brains. It became cultural, passed down through observation rather than genetics alone. A behavior inherited by watching, not by choice. By now, the bias was no longer quiet. It was normal. As early humans spent more time living in groups, something subtle but powerful began shaping behavior. Predictability. In a prehistoric camp, predictability wasn't boring. It was comforting. When everyone knew what everyone else was likely to do, fewer things went wrong. And fewer things going wrong meant fewer injuries, fewer arguments, and fewer funerals. When most people used the same hand for precise tasks, movement became easier to anticipate. You knew where someone's arm would swing when they struck stone. You knew which side they'd pass a tool from. You knew how close you could stand without suddenly losing a finger. This mattered more than you might think, especially when sharp objects were involved. Imagine several people working close together, shaping tools or processing food. If everyone moved differently, chaos followed. Arms crossed unpredictably, hands collided, someone got cut. Predictable movement reduced all of that. And predictability came from shared habits, including which hand did the dangerous work. Once a majority used the same hand, coordination improved automatically. Tasks flowed more smoothly. Teaching required fewer gestures. Demonstrations made sense without explanation. The group didn't become better because anyone was smarter. It became better because everyone moved the same way. This also mattered during hunting and defense. When people stood side by side, they needed to know how others would move, which arm would extend, which direction a throw would come from, which side someone would step toward when startled. Shared handedness made group motion feels synchronized, even without conscious planning. Those who match the group's movements fit in more easily, not socially literally. They move through space with fewer collisions and fewer corrections. That small advantage mattered in a world where mistakes cost energy, and energy was survival. People who didn't match weren't punished. They weren't expelled, but they stood out. They had to adapt more often. They had to explain themselves more. Their movements required adjustment from others, and in a prehistoric setting, being the one who required extra adjustment was inconvenient. So most people quietly aligned with the group, not because they were forced to, but because it worked. Humans have always favored behaviors that reduce friction. The hand that matched the group reduced friction in every sense of the word. At this point, handedness wasn't just about tools or brains. It was about moving safely among others, and predictability had become a survival trait. The group didn't choose a dominant hand. It simply drifted toward the one that caused fewer problems. If tool-making nudged humans toward a preferred hand, hunting shoved them firmly in that direction and then asked them to commit. Hunting wasn't a solo activity for long. Once early, humans began working together to bring down animals larger, faster, and significantly more annoyed than themselves. Coordination stopped being optional. Thrown weapons were the turning point. Spears, stones, and later sharpened projectiles demanded accuracy. A bad throw didn't just miss dinner. It alerted the dinner, and the dinner often responded with horns, hooves, or teeth. Precision mattered. Consistency mattered more. Throwing is not symmetrical. It relies on timing, balance, and follow-through. Repeating the same throwing motion with the same arm dramatically improves accuracy. Switching arms resets the learning curve. Early hunters didn't have the luxury of experimentation. They needed the arm that hit most often, not the arm that felt philosophically balanced. Once most hunters favored the same arm, hunting formations adapted. People spaced themselves based on expected throws. You knew which side someone would wind up from. You knew where not to stand unless you enjoyed sudden blunt force trauma. Shared handedness reduced friendly fire incidents, which were already unpopular. The same logic applied when things went wrong. Animals charged. Groups scattered. People reacted instinctively. Instinct favored the practiced hand. The hand that had thrown hundreds of times responded faster under stress. The other hand hesitated, and hesitation was rarely rewarded in prehistoric life. This didn't require violence between humans, though that came later. Just surviving the hunt was enough to reinforce the bias. Those who aligned with the dominant throwing pattern succeeded more often. Success meant food. Food meant survival. Survival meant passing on habits, not opinions. And here's the quiet part. Left-handed individuals didn't disappear. Some were excellent hunters. Some may have been better precisely because they were different. But being different required others to adjust, and adjustment introduced risk. In dangerous environments, groups prefer predictability over brilliance. A reliable hunter who throws the same way every time is easier to plan around than a surprising one who occasionally causes confusion. That doesn't make the surprising one bad, just inconvenient. So, hunting didn't eliminate variation. It locked in the majority. Once survival hinged on repeated, coordinated movement under stress, the hand that performed best most often became the default. Not because it was right, but because it worked. And in prehistory, it worked was the highest compliment nature ever gave. Hunting taught humans many things, but perhaps the most important lesson was this. Under stress, you do not rise to the occasion. You default to habit, and nothing reveals a habit faster than a moment when something large, fast, and very motivated is running toward you. In calm conditions, early humans could still use both hands fairly well. They could switch if needed. They could adapt. But stress has no patience for experimentation. When danger appeared suddenly, the brain skipped deliberation and reached for the movement it trusted most. The hand that had practiced more simply moved first. This is where handedness stopped being a mild preference and started becoming automatic. When a hunt went wrong, there was no time to think. You didn't evaluate which hand might be optimal today. You reacted. You threw. You struck. You grabbed. And every time stress forced the same hand into action, that pathway grew stronger. The brain quietly updated its notes. This is the hand we use when things get serious. Repeated stress locked this pattern in deeper than calm practice ever could. The hand that performed under pressure became the hand the body trusted. The other hand still worked. It just wasn't invited to emergencies anymore. This mattered outside of hunting, too. Sudden falls, slips on loose ground, encounters with predators, all demanded instant reactions. The same hand reached out to catch balance. The same arm shielded the body. The same side led when sprinting away in panic. Over time, the body developed a stress hierarchy. One side acted, the other assisted. Groups noticed this, even if they didn't articulate it. People began to expect certain movements from others during chaos. When danger erupted, you assumed your neighbor would react a certain way. That assumption reduced confusion. It also punished deviation. Someone who reacted differently forced others to adjust in moments when adjustment was costly. Again, no one banned alternative behavior. It just quietly failed more often. Children learned this pattern by observation. They saw which hand adults used when things went wrong, not when things went right. They copied the hand that acted fastest, not the one that looked balanced. Stress became the teacher. By now, handedness wasn't just about tools or teaching or hunting technique. It was about instinct. When the world went quiet, both hands were equal. When the world went wrong, one hand took charge. And once the body learns which side saves it most often, it never really forgets. Once stress revealed which hand humans trusted most, evolution did what it always does best. It quietly started keeping score, not with charts, not with numbers carved into stone tablets, but with a simple metric: who survived long enough to keep reproducing. Prehistoric life was not kind enough to tolerate inefficiency for very long. Small advantages didn't feel small when stacked day after day. The hand that reacted faster under pressure reduced injuries. Fewer injuries meant fewer infections. Fewer infections meant fewer funerals. And fewer funerals meant more people sticking around to raise children who copied their habits. This wasn't dramatic. No one dropped dead because they used the wrong hand once. It was subtler than that. People who favored the practiced hand made slightly fewer mistakes. They stumbled less. They recovered balance faster. They avoided one extra cut, one extra fall, one extra moment of hesitation. Over years, those tiny advantages added up. The other hand wasn't useless. Far from it. But when danger appeared suddenly, the body leaned on the hand it trusted. And trust is built through repetition, not fairness. The hand that had proven itself under pressure kept being chosen. The hand that kept being chosen kept getting better. From the outside, nothing looked different. Camps still functioned. People still hunted. Children still played in the dirt and put questionable things in their mouths. But beneath the surface, behavior was stabilizing. The same movements repeated across individuals. The same hand reached first. The same arm led. Groups didn't consciously select for this. They didn't need to. Natural selection handled it quietly, efficiently, and without feedback. Those whose habits aligned with the group's dominant pattern integrated more easily. Those who didn't had to adapt more often. Adaptation costs energy. Energy was precious. Over generations, this bias appeared earlier in life. Children began showing preference sooner, not because they were born that way yet, but because the environment reinforced it from the moment they could grab objects. The world rewarded one pattern more than the other. And here's the important part. The pattern didn't need to be perfect. It only needed to be common enough to matter. Once most people leaned one way, the environment itself pushed others in the same direction. No decision, no command, just survival math doing what it always does. By now, handedness wasn't a habit anymore. It was a trend with momentum. By the time survival statistics had quietly nudged humans toward a preferred hand, the process no longer waited for adulthood. It began early, very early, often before children understood what their hands were for beyond grabbing food and occasionally hitting siblings. Prehistoric children didn't receive lessons. They received environments, and those environments were already biased. Tools lay around the camp shaped for a certain grip. Adults moved in predictable ways. Tasks were demonstrated the same way again and again. Long before a child could consciously choose a hand, one hand was being invited to the party more often. When a child picked up a stone, adults corrected the motion without words. They adjusted the grip. They repositioned the arm. They showed the movement. And because most adults used the same hand, those corrections quietly favored that side. Not intentionally, just statistically. Children are learning machines with no filters. They don't ask, is this optimal? They ask, does this work? And what worked most often was what everyone else was doing. Using the same hand made copying easier. Easier meant fewer mistakes. Fewer mistakes meant fewer frustrated adults, which in prehistoric times was an underrated survival skill. As children practiced daily tasks, scraping hides, carrying food, shaping simple tools, muscle memory formed quickly. The hand used most often developed strength and coordination faster. The other hand didn't fall behind because it was weak. It fell behind because it was used less. Practice beats potential every time. This early reinforcement made handedness feel natural, even inevitable. By the time a child noticed they preferred one hand, the preference was already baked in. Asking them to switch would have felt strange, like asking them to suddenly walk backward everywhere. Importantly, this wasn't genetic destiny yet. It was learned behavior, shaped by environment. Some children still lean the other way, but the environment gently pushed most in the same direction. No pressure, no punishment, just gravity. And gravity always wins. Once this pattern reached childhood, it became incredibly stable. Adults weren't just passing down genes anymore. They were passing down habits before children could question them. Handedness stopped being something that emerged slowly. It appeared early and stayed. At this point in prehistory, the bias didn't feel like a bias. It felt like how hands worked. And that's the most powerful trick evolution ever plays, making history feel like instinct. Once handedness settled in early childhood, it stopped feeling like a behavior and started feeling like the way things were done. And humans are very good at turning repeated behavior into tradition without ever noticing the transition. One day you're copying movements because they work. The next day you're doing them because they feel normal, and shortly after that doing anything else feels suspicious. In prehistoric groups, traditions weren't announced. There were no elders standing around saying, "From now on, we strike stones with this hand." Traditions formed the same way paths formed by being walked on repeatedly until the ground forgot it could be anything else. Every daily task reinforced the same motion. Cutting meat, scraping hides, carving wood, passing tools. Each repetition quietly told the brain, this is correct. The other hand wasn't wrong. It was just unnecessary. And unnecessary things tend to fade politely into the background. Once habits reach this stage, they stop requiring attention. People no longer think about which hand they're using. They simply act. That automatic quality made work faster and coordination smoother. It also made deviation more noticeable. Someone using the opposite hand wasn't breaking a rule, but they were breaking expectation. Expectation matters in groups. When people expect a certain movement, they plan around it. They stand accordingly. They pass tools accordingly. They react accordingly. When someone moves differently, others must adjust. Adjustment takes effort. Effort costs energy. Energy was precious. So even without judgment, tradition nudged people toward conformity. Most humans happily complied, not out of fear, but because it reduced friction. Being predictable made life easier, and easy was good. Children absorbed this atmosphere without commentary. They didn't learn handedness as a concept. They learned it as background noise. The way the fire was built, the way tools were held, the way bodies moved around one another. By now, handedness had crossed an important threshold. It no longer depended on immediate survival advantage. It was maintained by comfort, and comfort is powerful. Once something feels comfortable, questioning it feels unnecessary. This is how small biases survive long after their original purpose fades. They don't need enforcement. They don't need belief. They just need repetition. At this point in prehistory, handedness wasn't about tools or hunting anymore. It was about rhythm, about shared movement, about doing things the way they had always been done. And once a behavior reaches that stage, it becomes very difficult to reverse, even if no one remembers why it started. For a long time, handedness was just behavior, a habit reinforced by tools, teaching, and social comfort. But evolution has a funny habit of watching what organisms do, repeatedly and quietly, adjusting the hardware to match. Not immediately, not dramatically, just slowly over generations, like a background software update no one asked for. Once most humans consistently favored one hand, their bodies began adapting in subtle ways. The preferred hand became stronger, faster, more coordinated. That alone wasn't genetic. Muscles respond to use, but the brain supporting that hand also developed more refined control. Neural pathways grew thicker. Signals traveled faster. Practice was literally reshaping the brain. Now imagine this pattern repeating across generations. Children grow up in an environment where one hand is used more. Their brains adapt early. Those whose nervous systems adapt efficiently perform tasks better. Better performance leads to fewer injuries and more success. More success leads to longer lives and more offspring. And suddenly, behavior starts whispering suggestions to biology. This doesn't mean babies were born right-handed overnight. Evolution doesn't work like flipping a switch. It works like erosion. Slow, patient, and relentless. Small neurological tendencies that made it easier to settle into the dominant pattern became slightly more common. Not guaranteed, just more likely. Some brains adapted faster to specialization. Some struggled more. Guess which ones thrived in a world that rewarded efficiency and punished hesitation? Over many generations, these tiny differences nudged population averages. The bias grew stronger earlier and harder to undo. Importantly, variation never vanished. Evolution hates monocultures. Too much sameness is risky. Left-leaning individuals continued to appear, partly because flexibility still had value, and partly because biology rarely reaches absolute extremes. A small minority remained different, and that difference occasionally paid off in unpredictable situations. But the majority trend kept drifting in the same direction. Once a behavior becomes common, the environment reinforces it. Once the environment reinforces it, biology begins accommodating it. This loop is powerful, quiet, and very difficult to reverse. By now, handedness wasn't just something people did. It was something bodies expected to do. And that's the moment when a prehistoric habit stopped being temporary. It became a trait. Not fixed, not universal, but persistent. All because early humans hit rocks the same way for a very long time and never thought to ask whether the other hand deserved a chance. Once behavior started nudging biology, the balance quietly tipped. Handedness no longer needed constant reinforcement to survive. It had reached a point where doing nothing was enough to keep it going. The majority had become the default. And defaults are powerful things. They don't argue. They don't persuade. They simply exist, and everyone adjusts around them. In prehistoric groups, no one woke up thinking, I will now conform to the dominant hand preference. They woke up thinking about food, shelter, and whether something nearby wanted to eat them. But every object they touched already assumed a certain way of being held. Every movement they watched already followed a familiar pattern. The environment itself leaned one way. When most people use the same hand, the world subtly reorganizes around that fact. Tools are shaped accordingly. Tasks are demonstrated accordingly. Space is navigated accordingly. Even without intention, the majority hand becomes the path of least resistance. For someone leaning the other way, nothing was impossible, just slightly harder. Copying movements took more effort. Learning from demonstrations required mental flipping. Timing fell off. These weren't dramatic barriers. They were small annoyances. But prehistoric life was already full of discomfort, and humans are very good at avoiding unnecessary ones. So most people settled into the majority pattern without thinking about it. The hand that fit the world required less adjustment. Less adjustment meant less energy spent on adaptation. Less energy spent adapting meant more energy available for survival. This is how a preference becomes invisible. When something works for most people, it stops being noticed. It fades into the background of daily life. No one praises it. No one questions it. It simply feels normal. At this point, handedness was no longer actively evolving through trial and error. It was being maintained through inertia. The system had momentum, and momentum doesn't need justification. Variation still existed. Some individuals favored the opposite hand. They adapted. They functioned. They survived. But the world did not reorganize for them. They reorganized themselves around the world. By now, the question wasn't which hand is better. It was why would anyone bother changing? And once a behavior reaches that stage, When changing feels harder than continuing, it tends to persist for a very long time, even across tens of thousands of years. By now, it might sound like prehistoric humans were on track to become perfectly uniform, all moving in the same direction with the same hand, like a very disorganized marching band. But evolution rarely allows anything to become that tidy. Just when you think a pattern has fully taken over, variation stubbornly refuses to leave. Left-handedness didn't vanish. It never did. And the reason is simple. Being different sometimes helps. In a world where most people moved, threw, struck, and reacted the same way, someone who did things differently introduced unpredictability. Unpredictability can be inconvenient for teaching, but can be extremely useful in chaotic situations. During hunts, sudden confrontations, or moments of confusion, a person whose movements didn't match expectations could gain a small edge. That edge didn't need to be dramatic. It didn't need to win every encounter. It only needed to help occasionally. Evolution doesn't require dominance. It requires persistence. Left-leaning individuals were often more flexible. They learned to adapt in a world built around the majority. They switched tasks more easily. They compensated. They adjusted. That adaptability itself was valuable in unpredictable environments. Importantly, prehistoric groups didn't persecute difference. There was no ideology attached to handedness yet. No one thought one hand was evil or cursed. That comes later. In prehistory, difference was tolerated as long as it didn't cause constant problems, and left-handed individuals usually figured out how to make things work. From an evolutionary standpoint, this balance made sense. Too much uniformity is risky. If an environment changes suddenly, a population that behaves identically can fail together. Variation provides insurance. It's nature's backup plan. So left-handedness lingered at low levels. Not common enough to disrupt coordination. Not rare enough to disappear. Just enough to keep the system flexible. This is why handedness never reached 100% dominance. The system stabilized instead. Most people favor one hand. A minority favor the other. The balance held. And once a trait stabilizes like that, it becomes remarkably resilient. It survives migrations, climate shifts, and technological changes. It gets carried forward simply because nothing pushes it strongly enough to change. By the end of deep prehistory, handedness had settled into a familiar pattern, mostly one way, occasionally the other, and never fully explained by anyone living through it. The bias was real. The variation was real. And both were here to stay. By the end of deep prehistory, nothing dramatic had happened to lock and handedness. There was no final moment, no turning point, no cave painting declaring one hand superior. Instead, something much quieter occurred. The bias simply stayed. What began as flexibility gave way to habit. Habit turned into tradition. Tradition nudged biology. Biology stabilized the pattern. And once that loop formed, it didn't need constant reinforcement anymore. It ran on momentum alone. Most humans now grew up favoring one hand without questioning it. They didn't know they were participating in an ancient evolutionary trend. They weren't aware they were inheriting a behavioral bias tens of thousands of years old. They just reached out, grabbed something, and kept going with their day. The environment supported this without effort. Tools felt right in one hand. Movements flowed more smoothly that way. Learning felt easier. Deviating required thought, and thought was energy. Energy was precious. So, most people didn't bother. And that's the important part. Handedness didn't win because it was optimal in some perfect sense. It won because it was good enough and already there. Evolution loves good enough. It avoids unnecessary upgrades. Left-handed individuals continued to exist quietly and persistently. They adapted to a world that leaned the other way. Sometimes that difference helped. Sometimes it didn't. But it never disappeared because complete uniformity is dangerous. Variation kept the population resilient. By now, handedness had become invisible. People no longer noticed it forming. They only noticed it when something went wrong. When a movement felt awkward, when a tool didn't fit, when someone moved differently. That's usually how ancient traits survive. They disappear into the background until friction reminds you they're there. As humans prepared to leave prehistory behind, inventing symbols, building shelters meant to last, and eventually writing things down, they carried this bias with them. Not as a rule, not as a belief, just as a default. One hand led, the other adapted, and no one alive at the time knew why. That's how most of human evolution works. Not through grand decisions, but through small conveniences repeated until they feel inevitable. And once something feels inevitable, it tends to stick around for a very long time. Cornelia enters the story already wrapped in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the heavy, watchful silence Rome reserves for its Vestal virgins. From the moment she is chosen, her life stops belonging to her. She wears white wool, not because it is modest, but because it is symbolic. White means untouched. Wool means old Rome, ancient Rome, the Rome that pretends nothing ever changes. Cornelia is no longer a daughter, a future wife, or even fully a person. She is a walking promise that the city will not collapse tomorrow. The Vests are expected to be perfect, but never visible. Everyone knows who they are, yet no one is supposed to look too closely. They live in privilege, housed near the Forum, exempt from a father's authority, allowed to own property, and escorted through the streets with ceremonial respect. And yet every step is monitored. A Vestal's virtue is not private morality. It is state infrastructure. If Cornelia fails, Rome fails at the least. That is the superstition everyone pretends not to question. Her vow lasts 30 years. 30 years without marriage, without intimacy, without the ordinary human mistakes Rome forgives in everyone else. Senators cheat openly. Generals father children across provinces. Even the gods misbehave constantly. But a Vestal must remain untouched, or else the universe itself is supposedly offended. This is not faith. It is pressure disguised as holiness. Cornelia's daily life is rigid but quiet, tending the sacred fire, performing rituals few fully understand, reciting formulas older than memory. There is no applause for doing it right, only punishment if something goes wrong. The fire goes out, a beating, a rumor spreads, an investigation. Rome is not interested in certainty, only reassurance. And reassurance requires a scapegoat when anxiety rises. By the 1st century before the Common Era, Rome is already nervous. Civil wars, political assassinations, collapsing traditions. Old morals are preached loudly precisely because fewer people believe in them. In this climate, the Vests become symbols again, dragged back into the spotlight whenever the state feels threatened. Cornelia does not choose this role. She inherits it. What matters most is not who Cornelia is, but what she represents. She is expected to be spotless in a city that is anything but. Her body becomes a boundary Rome draws to convince itself that order still exists somewhere. And boundaries once drawn invite testing. Long before accusations surface, Cornelia is already standing on a fragile line. All it takes now is suspicion, and Rome is very good at that. Cornelia did not volunteer to become a Vestal virgin. No one ever did. Selection happened early, usually in childhood, when a girl was young enough to be shaped and old enough to understand fear. Priests chose carefully, healthy body, respectable family, no visible flaws. Rome wanted symbols that looked convincing. Once chosen, consent was a formality. Refusal was not really an option. The gods had allegedly spoken. Parents smiled through clenched teeth. A daughter was taken, and the family gained honor in exchange for absence. For Cornelia, the transition was abrupt. One day, she belonged to a household governed by a father. The next, she belonged to the state. The Vestals lived apart, removed from ordinary Roman rhythms. No marriage negotiations, no domestic duties, no children. Freedom technically, but only if freedom means being watched by everyone and trusted by no one. The Vestal house was both sanctuary and cage. Training was relentless. Rituals had to be memorized perfectly. Movements repeated until muscle replaced thought. Mistakes were not framed as learning experiences. They were omens. A mispronounced prayer could mean divine displeasure. A clumsy gesture might explain a bad harvest or a military loss weeks later. Rome connected dots aggressively when it felt anxious. And it often felt anxious. Cornelia learned quickly that her body was public property. How she walked, how she spoke, how she looked at others. Too cold, and she was arrogant. Too warm, and she was suspicious. Neutrality was the goal. But neutrality is difficult to maintain when everyone is searching for meaning. Even breathing wrong could become a narrative. Yet the Vestals were powerful in subtle ways. They could pardon condemned men by chance encounter. Their testimony held unusual weight. They sat in places of honor at public games. Rome respected them because it feared what would happen without them. That fear was both protection and threat. Reverence can turn into violence when disappointment arrives. Cornelia grows into her role as the city grows more unstable. Political rivalries intensify. Public morality becomes performance art. Everyone talks about virtue because everyone suspects its absence. In this environment, the Vestal virgins become less like priestesses and more like stress indicators. When things go wrong, people look at them first. Cornelia understands this long before her name is spoken aloud. She watches other Vestals disciplined for small errors. She hears whispers about earlier trials, about punishments buried rather than discussed. The message is clear. Purity is not something you are. It is something you must constantly prove. And proof in Rome is often decided after the fact. Cornelius's fall does not begin with evidence. It begins the way most Roman scandals do, with murmurs, a look held too long, a favor granted too easily, a man seen leaving a place he should not have been near. In Rome, rumor is not background noise. It is a political tool, a form of entertainment, and occasionally a weapon sharpened for convenience. Truth is optional. Repetition is not. By the late 1st century, before the Common Era, Rome thrives on accusation. The Republic is fraying, and everyone senses it. When institutions weaken, moral panic fills the gap. People want explanations for disasters, defeats, and unease. And explanations are much easier when they wear a human face, preferably a female one sworn to impossible standards. Cornelia's name begins circulating quietly, not shouted, whispered, which is worse. Loud accusations demand proof. Whispers invite imagination. A Vestal accused of breaking her vow is the perfect storm. Sacred betrayal, sexual scandal, divine anger, and political distraction rolled into one. It does not matter whether the accusation is true. It matters that it feels useful. Rome tells itself that the Vestals are above suspicion. In practice, they are under permanent surveillance. Their interactions are monitored, their movements recorded, their friendships judged. Cornelia likely senses the shift before anything official happens. The smiles grow tighter. The glances linger. Silence becomes interpretive. At this stage, nothing concrete is required. Roman law allows suspicion to harden into assumption. If the gods seem displeased, someone must be responsible. Crops fail. Omens appear. A fire behaves strangely. None of these things need direct connection to Cornelia. The logic runs backward. Something is wrong. Therefore, someone must have sinned. Therefore, someone will be found. The most dangerous part is that Cornelia cannot defend herself in ordinary ways. She cannot explain private behavior because she is not supposed to have any. She cannot point to a husband or household to vouch for her because she has neither. Her virtue is assumed until it is questioned. Once questioned, it becomes nearly impossible to prove. Rome claims to revere purity, but what it really worships is control. A Vestal's body is symbolic territory. Accusing Cornelia is not just about her. It is about reminding everyone that sacred roles exist only as long as the state allows them to. Rumor becomes rehearsal. The city is testing how ready it is to condemn. By the time the accusation is spoken aloud, Cornelia's fate is already leaning in one direction. Trials in Rome rarely begin with neutrality. They begin with a story people have already decided to believe. When Cornelia is formally accused, Rome pretends to be shocked. This is theater. Everyone has already rehearsed the outrage in private. The charge is simple and devastating. Violation of the Vestal vow of chastity. There are few crimes in Rome more symbolically explosive. A Vestal's impurity is not treated as a personal failing. It is treated as a crack in the cosmic order. Cornelia is no longer a woman on trial. She is a bad omen with a pulse. The proceedings are led by the College of Pontiffs, men who are both priests and politicians. This matters. The trial is not about discovering truth, but restoring confidence. Rome does not need certainty. It needs closure. And closure in religious cases often looks like punishment rather than proof. Cornelia is allowed to speak, but only within strict limits. She cannot cross-examine accusers. She cannot demand evidence in a modern sense. Roman law, especially sacred law, operates on reputation, interpretation, and perceived sincerity. How she speaks matters more than what she says. Calm can look cold. Emotion can look guilty. Silence can look arrogant. There is no winning posture. Witnesses are vague. Testimony relies on implication rather than fact. A man was seen nearby. A routine was broken. A gesture was misread. Each fragment alone means nothing. Together they create a story. And Rome loves stories that explain its fears. Cornelia insists on her innocence. Vestals accused falsely often do. That is not unusual. What is unusual is that Rome seems unconvinced before she finishes speaking. The city is tense. Political factions are clashing. Morality trials offer a convenient outlet. Punishing a Vestal reassures the public that the gods are still being managed, that corruption has boundaries somewhere. There's also precedent, and precedent is cruel. Previous Vestals have been condemned under similar circumstances. Their names are remembered not for evidence, but for outcome. Once the charge is credible enough to be public, acquittal becomes dangerous. If Cornelia is innocent, then Rome has been wrong. If Rome is wrong, then the gods may be angry for reasons no one controls. It is safer to be decisive than accurate. The atmosphere is heavy with inevitability. Cornelia stands alone in ceremonial white, surrounded by men whose authority depends on her conviction making sense. Her life is weighed against public anxiety, and anxiety usually wins. By the time judgment approaches, the question is no longer whether Cornelia broke her vow. The question is whether Rome can afford to believe that she did not. The punishment for a condemned vessel is designed to look merciful while being anything but. Rome cannot spill the blood of a sacred virgin. That would be impious. Instead, it invents a workaround that satisfies religion, law, and cruelty all at once. Cornelia is sentenced to be buried alive. Officially, the gods take responsibility. After that, Rome washes its hands. The ritual is carefully choreographed. There is no shouting crowd, no public spectacle in the arena. This is not entertainment. It is solemn, almost embarrassed. Cornelia is led in silence through the streets, escorted like an honored guest rather than a criminal. The city watches anyway. It always does. Respect and fear blur into something deeply uncomfortable. She is taken to a small underground chamber just outside the city boundary. Rome is precise about geography when it comes to guilt. The chamber contains a bed, a lamp, a little food, a little water, enough supposedly to prove that Rome did not kill her. What happens next is framed as divine judgment. The logic is delicate and absurd. Cornelia is not executed. She is abandoned. Before she descends, the Pontifex Maximus performs prayers. The language is formal, detached. This is not about Cornelia as a person. This is about restoring balance. The gods must be appeased. The city must move on. If she is innocent, the gods will intervene. If not, then justice has been done. Either way, Rome wins. Cornelia says little according to later accounts. Some claim she protests. Others insist she walks calmly, dignified to the end. The truth is unknowable, filtered through generations of moral storytelling. What matters is how Rome remembers her final moments. Silence becomes virtue. Resistance becomes guilt. Composure becomes proof of acceptance. Once the chamber is sealed, the city exhales. Anxiety has been addressed. A problem has been contained underground. Life resumes. Markets open. Debates continue. Rome congratulates itself on having faced impurity heathen. The sacred fire still burns. That is what counts. But the punishment lingers in the imagination. Burial alive is not just death. It is erasure performed politely. Cornelia disappears without blood, without noise, without disruption. Her body becomes a message. This is the cost of failing a symbol. Whether she was guilty no longer matters. The ritual has transformed her into something else. Not a Vestal, not a woman, but a warning. And Rome is very good at remembering warnings when it suits its sense of order. After Cornelius's death, Rome does what it always does best. It narrates itself into comfort. Officially, justice has been served. The gods have been appeased. The sacred order has been restored, But beneath the surface, something does not sit right. Cornelia's case leaves behind an unease that cannot be buried as neatly as her body. The problem is evidence, or rather the lack of it. No lover is publicly named. No confession is recorded. No decisive proof ever emerges. Roman writers are strangely vague when discussing the details. A silence that speaks louder than certainty. This is unusual in a culture that loves specificity when condemning moral failure. Rome normally names names. Here it hesitates. Some contemporaries begin to whisper a different interpretation. Perhaps Cornelia was innocent. Perhaps she was convenient. In a time of political instability, accusations against Vestals spike suspiciously often. When the state feels threatened, purity trials multiply. Cornelius's condemnation begins to look less like justice and more like ritualized anxiety management. Roman law is flexible when it wants to be. Powerful men escape punishment for crimes far more concrete than Cornelius's alleged offense. Adultery laws are enforced selectively. Corruption is tolerated openly. Yet a Vestal sworn to embody perfection is held to a standard no human can meet. The imbalance becomes difficult to ignore. Later commentators struggle with her case. Some defend the verdict out of loyalty to tradition. To question it would mean admitting that Rome killed an innocent woman to calm itself. Others hedge, suggesting divine mysteries beyond human understanding. A few are bolder, hinting that Cornelia was the victim of politics disguised as religion. What makes her story unsettling is not just her death, but how little Rome seems to learn from it. There is no reform, no tightening of legal standards, no reflection on the burden placed on Vestals. The system remains intact because acknowledging its failure would destabilize more than a single trial. It would expose the fragility of sacred authority itself. Cornelia's name survives not because she was proven guilty, but because she was memorable. Her case becomes shorthand for the dangers of suspicion and the violence of moral certainty. Even in a society comfortable with brutality, burying a woman alive without proof leaves a stain. Rome moves forward as it always does, but Cornelius's shadow lingers in the legal imagination. Her story quietly asks a question Roman power prefers not to answer. When purity is enforced by fear, is it purity at all? Cornelia does not disappear after her death. She changes form from a living Vestal. She becomes precedent. Roman law absorbs her quietly the way it absorbs most uncomfortable lessons. Not by reforming itself, but by pointing backward and saying, "This is how it has always been done." Her burial becomes an example cited whenever Vestal discipline is discussed, a reminder wrapped in solemn language. The irony is sharp. Vestals are meant to stand outside ordinary law, protected by their sacred status. Yet, Cornelia's case shows how easily that protection collapses. The same holiness that elevates them also isolates them. When accused, a Vestal has fewer defenses than an ordinary woman, not more. Her exceptional status works against her. Law bends more easily around symbols than around people. Future Vestals grow up knowing her story. It is not told in detail. It does not need to be. The outline is enough. A name, a charge, an underground chamber. Fear does the rest. Discipline tightens not because rules change, but because imagination fills in the gaps. Cornelia becomes a silent instructor, enforcing obedience long after her voice is gone. Roman authorities benefit from this ambiguity. A clear miscarriage of justice would invite criticism. A vague ritualized punishment invites reverence. Cornelia's death is framed as tragic but necessary, a sacrifice to stability. The state presents itself as reluctant, burdened by duty. This framing is powerful. It discourages sympathy and replaces it with resignation. Her case also reinforces a dangerous idea that moral purity can be legislated into existence. Rome convinces itself that fear produces virtue, that the threat of annihilation ensures obedience. In reality, it produces silence. Vestals become more cautious, more isolated, less human. Any mistake becomes potentially fatal, not because of divine wrath, but because of institutional panic. Cornelia's individuality is erased almost completely. Later, writers focus on the mechanism, not the woman. Burial alive becomes the topic, not the life lost within it. This is how systems protect themselves, by abstracting suffering into procedure. And yet, the discomfort never fully goes away. Cornelia's story is retold precisely because it unsettles. It exposes the gap between Rome's moral self-image and its actions. A society confident in its justice does not need to kill its symbols quietly. In turning Cornelia into law, Rome reveals its priorities: order over truth, stability over mercy, ritual over humanity. Her body becomes a boundary marker, warning others not to cross lines that were never clearly drawn. And in that transformation, Cornelia stops being a vestal and becomes something more enduring, a question Rome never quite manages to silence. Long after Cornelia's body is sealed away, her story continues to move through Roman memory in an uncomfortable half-light. She is remembered, but never clearly. Not as a heroine, not as a villain, just as a case. And that ambiguity is precisely why she lingers. Rome is excellent at celebrating certainty. It is far less comfortable with doubt that refuses to disappear. Writers who mention Cornelia do so cautiously. Some repeat the official version, carefully neutral, as if copying from a legal notice. Others soften the edges, emphasizing her dignity, her composure, her silence. These details are not accidental. They allow later Romans to admire her without questioning the system that destroyed her. Tragedy is acceptable. Error is not. But beneath these polished retellings, skepticism grows. If Cornelia was truly guilty, why is the evidence never clearly stated? If the gods are satisfied, why does her story keep resurfacing? Rome rarely dwells on resolved matters. It revisits unresolved ones obsessively. Cornelia becomes a moral ghost, appearing whenever questions of religious authority and legal cruelty intersect. Her case also exposes a deeper contradiction in Roman thinking. The city prides itself on rational law, on procedure, precedent, and civic order. Yet in Cornelius's trial, emotion, fear, and symbolism dominate. The law does not weigh facts. It weighs anxiety. The more Rome insists on its rationality, the more Cornelius's fate undermines the claim. Over time, she begins to attract sympathy, especially in periods when Rome itself feels morally uncertain, when civil wars erupt, when emperors abuse religious authority, when purity laws are weaponized again. Cornelia's story feels uncomfortably familiar. She becomes less an isolated tragedy and more a warning about what happens when institutions confuse control with virtue. Even the punishment itself troubles later sensibilities. Burial alive is framed as pious restraint, but its cruelty is undeniable. It is slow. It is silent. It is designed to hide responsibility behind ritual. That design becomes increasingly hard to defend as Roman thinkers begin cautiously to reflect on justice as something more than tradition. Cornelia's afterlife is not divine. It is intellectual. She survives as doubt embedded in history, a reminder that sacred law can destroy the very values it claims to protect. Rome never formally apologizes. It never reopens the case, but it never fully lets her go either. And that unresolved tension is her final legacy. Cornelia does not return as proof of guilt or innocence. She returns as discomfort, as the quiet question Rome never answers. What if order was preserved at the cost of truth? Cornelia's story ends without resolution, and that is precisely why it endures. Rome wanted her case to close a wound. Instead, it left a scar. The trial, the punishment, the silence afterward were all meant to restore confidence in divine order and civic discipline. Yet, the lingering uncertainty surrounding her guilt undermines that goal. The system that relies on fear rather than clarity may function, but it does not convince. What Cornelia represents in the end is not chastity or sacrilege, but the danger of turning morality into spectacle. Rome believed that by destroying one symbol of impurity, it could cleanse itself. But symbols are fragile things. Once broken, they do not reassure. They haunt. Cornelia becomes a reminder that purity enforced by violence is not purity at all, but performance backed by terror. Her case also exposes how justice shifts when the accused is required to embody perfection. Ordinary Romans are allowed contradiction. Vestals are not. The moment doubt enters the picture, innocence becomes irrelevant. Cornelia is punished not because she is proven guilty, but but because the idea of her guilt is too destabilizing to ignore. Rome chooses certainty over truth, ritual over mercy. Centuries later, her story still feels uncomfortably modern. Institutions continue to demand symbolic figures to reassure anxious societies. When systems fail, individuals are often sacrificed to preserve appearances. Cornelia's trial shows how easily law bends when it serves emotional needs rather than ethical ones. The procedures look solemn. The outcome feels inevitable. Responsibility dissolves into tradition. There is no moral triumph here. No clear lesson neatly wrapped. That is why Cornelia matters. She forces us to sit with ambiguity, to recognize how often power disguises fear as virtue, how often silence is mistaken for consent, how easily justice becomes theater when authority feels threatened. Rome survives Cornelia. Of course, empires always survive individuals, but survival is not the same as righteousness. Cornelia's name outlives the men who condemned her because her story exposes something fragile at the heart of Roman confidence. The law that claims to protect order can also destroy innocence without ever admitting it has done so. In the end, Cornelia is not remembered for what she did, but for what Rome did to her. And that reversal is quietly devastating. Her story asks a final unresolved question, one Rome never answers, and history keeps repeating. When a society punishes someone to preserve its image, who is really on trial? Roman baths were never just about washing dirt off the body. They were about being Roman. From the moment you stepped through the entrance, it was clear this was not a private activity or a quiet routine. Baths were loud, crowded, steamy, and unapologetically social. If you wanted solitude, you stayed home. If you wanted to exist in Roman society, you went to the baths. Most Romans visited nearly every day, not because they were obsessed with hygiene in the modern sense, but because the bathhouse was where life happened after midday. It was where you relaxed, showed off, listened, watched, and were watched in return. Missing the baths meant missing conversations, deals, rumors, and subtle shifts in public opinion. In a city obsessed with status, absence could be noticed just as much as presence. The architecture alone made a statement. Massive halls, vate ceilings, marble floors, painted walls, and statues everywhere. Even ordinary citizens bathed in surroundings that looked imperial. This was intentional. The baths were a message carved in stone. Rome provides. Emperors poured enormous resources into bath complexes because nothing advertised power better than hot water flowing freely to the masses. Bread and circuses mattered, but warm baths every afternoon created loyalty on a daily basis. Inside, the atmosphere was anything but serene. Slaves hurried back and forth. Vendors sold snacks, oils, and drinks. Voices echoed off stone walls. Philosophers argued. Politicians listened more than they spoke. Athletes stretched. Old men complained. Young men pined. Everyone was naked, but no one was equal. Status followed you even into steam and sweat. Bathing followed a loose routine, but rules were flexible. You exercised, scraped sweat and oil from your skin, moved through hot rooms, warm rooms, and cold plunges. But the order mattered less than the interactions along the way. Conversations began in one room and ended in another. A joke overheard in the steam could become gossip by the time you hit the cold pool. Cleanliness was almost secondary. The real function of the baths was connection. Information flowed faster here than anywhere else in the city. If something was happening politically, socially, or scandalously, it surfaced in the baths first. The water washed bodies, but the space exposed people. And in Rome, being exposed was never neutral. Once inside the baths, Rome's social hierarchy did not disappear. It simply changed clothes. Everyone bathed together in theory, but status was still carefully observed in practice. Senators, equestrians, freedmen, and laborers all shared the same spaces, yet they moved through them differently. Who you spoke to, where you lingered, and how confidently you occupied space all signaled your position without a single word being spoken. The layout of a Roman bath house guided behavior. Large, open halls encouraged movement and visibility. Smaller rooms created intimacy and opportunity. The hottest rooms drew those eager to show endurance and toughness. The cold plunge attracted spectators as much as swimmers because nothing revealed self-control like not flinching when your body screamed. Rome admired discipline, even when it involved shivering in public. Nudity did not erase power. It emphasized it. The wealthy arrived with entourages of slaves carrying towels, oils, and scraping tools. Their bodies were groomed, fed well, and carefully maintained. The poor came alone, doing what they could with what they had. Everyone noticed the difference. The baths were democratic only in access, not in appearance. Conversation flowed freely, but not randomly. Powerful men listened for opportunity. Favor could be won or lost between steam and marble. A well-timed comment could open doors. A careless remark could close them. The baths were a testing ground where reputations were adjusted daily through hundreds of small interactions. No formal speeches were needed. Influence spread quietly, carried by heat and proximity. Women, when present, experienced the baths differently. In many periods, bathing was segregated by time or space, but rules varied. Where mixed bathing occurred, it was controversial, watched closely, and morally charged. The baths amplified anxieties about desire, control, and reputation. Even when separated, gossip crossed walls easily. Privacy was always temporary. The physical structure reinforced Rome's values. The baths were meticulously maintained, regulated, and funded. Disorder here would imply disorder everywhere. Clean water, heated floors, and smooth stone reassured citizens that the system worked. If Rome could organize something this complex and luxurious for everyday use, it must be strong. But beneath the polished surfaces, tension simmered. Everyone was visible. Everyone was evaluated. The baths offered relaxation, but they also demanded performance. In Rome, even leisure was competitive, and nowhere was that clearer than a room full of steam, where status followed you, even when you had nothing left to wear. If the Roman baths had a true specialty, it was not hygiene, it was information. The hot rooms, thick with steam and half-heard conversations, functioned as Rome's most efficient rumor mill. Voices carried strangely through the heat. Words floated, detached from their speakers, and reassembled themselves into stories by the time they reached the next room. Nothing spread faster in Rome than a secret overheard, while everyone pretended not to listen. The heat did something to people. It loosened tongues as effectively as wine, but with better acoustics. Men complained about rivals, boasted about connections, hinted at promotions, and leaked just enough detail to seem important. No one announced news directly. That would look desperate. Instead, they let it slip casually, knowing someone else would carry it onward. Politics thrived here. Senators did not make speeches in the baths, but they paid close attention. Alliances were tested in small talk. Reactions were measured carefully. A raised eyebrow could matter more than a vote in the forum. The baths offered plausible deniability. If something backfired, it was only chatter. If it succeeded, it was influence. Scandals found fertile ground in steam. Affairs, divorces, debts, and family disputes circulated constantly. The nakedness of the setting added to the thrill. Rome pretended to value restraint, but it loved exposure. The baths blurred boundaries between public and private in a way few other spaces could. Everyone was physically vulnerable, which made reputations feel vulnerable, too. Even emperors were not immune. Their names were whispered with caution, but they were whispered nonetheless. Praise could turn to mockery in the time it took to move from hot room to cold pool. The baths offered a rare illusion of safety. There were no scribes, no official records, only memory. But memory in Rome was dangerous enough. Slaves and attendants became accidental couriers of gossip. They heard everything while being ignored. A remark meant for one ear might reach dozens by nightfall. The baths functioned as a social amplifier, turning small comments into shared assumptions. This constant circulation of information made the baths powerful and risky. Say too little, and you seem irrelevant. Say too much, and you might regret it. Silence could be interpreted as caution or weakness. Speech was never neutral. In a society obsessed with reputation, the baths were both mirror and magnifying glass. They reflected what people already suspected and enlarged it until it felt undeniable. Long before news reached official channels, it had already soaked into the walls of the hot room. And once something took root there, it rarely stayed contained. Roman baths were one of the few places where bodies were openly and constantly evaluated. This was not accidental. The culture admired physical discipline, health, and control, and the bathhouse put all of it on display. Strength, scars, posture, and confidence were read like text. A body told a story before its owner ever spoke. Athleticism mattered. Men who exercised before bathing did so in full view, stretching, lifting, sparring, or running. Sweat was proof of effort. A well-trained body suggested moral strength, self-control, and readiness for public life. A soft body suggested indulgence. Rome judged relentlessly, even when pretending not to. Scars carried special meaning. Military wounds commanded respect, but only certain kinds. Scars on the front of the body implied bravery. Scars on the back suggested retreat. The baths turned veterans into living resumes. Younger men watched closely, learning what kind of future they were expected to earn. Grooming was another form of signaling. Oils, perfumes, and scraping tools were not just about cleanliness. They marked wealth and leisure. A man with attendants and fine oils was clearly successful. One who hurried through alone was not. Excess, however, invited mockery. Rome valued balance, at least in theory. Too much attention to appearance could brand someone as vain or unmanly. Aging bodies were treated with polite cruelty. The baths were not kind to the elderly. Wrinkles, sagging flesh, and trembling hands were visible to all. Respect existed, but so did discomfort. Old men were reminders of decline in a culture obsessed with vitality. They lingered anyway, because to withdraw was to disappear socially. Women's bodies, when present in bath spaces, were subject to even sharper scrutiny. Beauty invited attention. Modesty invited suspicion. The baths intensified cultural anxieties about desire and control. Even in segregated settings, bodies were discussed across walls. Absence of sight did not prevent judgment. Illness was also visible here. Lameness, skin conditions, and weakness could not be hidden. The baths promised health, but they also exposed vulnerability. In a society that valued strength, exposure could be humiliating. In the bathhouse, the body became public property. There was no privacy, only varying degrees of scrutiny. Rome did not just clean bodies. It read them, ranked them, and remembered them. And once seen, a body could not easily escape the story others told about it. Despite the marble, steam, and constant bathing, Roman hygiene worked very differently from modern expectations. Soap, as we know it, was not standard. Instead, Romans coated their bodies in oil, exercised until they were thoroughly sweaty, and then scraped everything off with a curved metal tool called a strategil. In theory, this removed dirt and dead skin. In practice, it removed oil, sweat, dust, and whatever else had attached itself to the body that day. Cleanliness was achieved by subtraction rather than washing. This process was communal and rarely delicate. Scraping could be rough, especially when done by slaves who were paid for speed, not gentleness. The removed mixture collected on the floor where it was swept away along with hair, skin flakes, and general grime. The baths were cleaned regularly, but not obsessively. The idea that Roman baths were pristine is a modern fantasy. They were functional, busy, and often messy. The water itself was reused. Pools were drained periodically, not constantly refreshed. Hot rooms encouraged sweating, which meant bodily fluids circulated freely. Cold plunges offered relief, but also shared whatever the previous bathers brought in with them. Romans accepted this without much concern. Cleanliness was about feeling refreshed and socially present, not eliminating microbes no one knew existed. Public health was not the goal. Social participation was bathing made you acceptable, not sterile. A person who smelled strongly or skipped the baths entirely was considered neglectful or antisocial. The baths set the baseline for normally, not perfection. Ironically, this shared hygiene reinforced social bonds. Everyone endured the same conditions. Complaints about water temperature, slippery floors, or overzealous scrapers became conversation starters. Shared discomfort created familiarity. The baths were not luxurious retreats. They were lived in spaces. Perfumes played an important role here. Strong scents masked unpleasant realities and doubled as status symbols. Exotic oils advertised wealth and connections. Smell became another social signal layered over sight and speech. From a modern perspective, Roman bath hygiene seemed questionable. From a Roman perspective, it worked well enough. People bathed frequently, felt refreshed, and maintained social cohesion. Disease existed, but it was not linked to bathing in their understanding. What mattered was participation. The baths did not aim to eliminate dirt entirely. They aimed to reset the body socially. After scraping, oiling, and plunging, you emerged acceptable again. And in Rome, acceptability mattered far more than being truly clean. The Roman baths were officially apolitical spaces. In reality, they were anything but. Politics simply changed tone here. Instead of speeches and laws, influence flowed through proximity, timing, and carefully casual conversation. A chance meeting in the warm room could matter more than a formal appointment. The baths offered access without paperwork. Men of power used the bath strategically. Arriving at the right hour ensured the right audience. Lingering near certain pools signaled openness to conversation. Leaving early could send a message. Nothing was accidental, even when everyone pretended it was. The informal setting allowed discussions that would be dangerous in official spaces. Aspiring politicians learned quickly. Speak just enough to be remembered. Laugh at the right jokes. Agree without committing. The baths rewarded subtlety. Blunt ambition looked crude here. Influence worked best when it felt effortless. A nod from a senator in the steam could elevate a career. Being ignored could end one. Even emperors understood the value of the baths. Some attended publicly, reinforcing their image as accessible leaders. Others avoided them, creating mystique. Either choice was political. The baths were one of the few places where social mixing felt natural, making them powerful tools for image management. Rumors tested political waters. A controversial idea could be floated lightly, gauged by reaction, then withdrawn or amplified accordingly. If people nodded, it moved forward. If they frowned, it vanished. The BS acted as an unofficial focus group for policy and power. Conflicts also simmered here. Rivalries did not pause for leisure. Insults were veiled, never explicit. A pointed joke, a deliberate snub. A remark delivered, just loudly enough to be overheard. Violence was rare, but tension was constant. Everyone knew who disliked whom long before it became public. The presence of slaves and attendants complicated everything. They were invisible, but everywhere. Politicians spoke carefully, knowing words might travel. Yet they also relied on these same attendants to spread favorable impressions. Information moved both ways. The baths blurred boundaries between public service and personal ambition. Deals were not signed here, but they were shaped. Alliances were not announced, but they were felt. Rome liked to imagine its politics as rational and procedural. The baths exposed the truth. Power was social before it was legal. By the time men left the pools, many decisions had already been made. The forum would merely formalize what steam and stone had quietly arranged. In Rome, politics did not begin with law. It began with conversation. And nowhere was conversation more potent than in warm water. Roman baths promised relaxation, but they also stirred anxiety. Any place where bodies gathered, rules softened, and conversations flowed was bound to worry moral authorities. Pleasure made Rome uneasy, especially when it could not be neatly regulated. The baths embodied this tension perfectly. They were essential to civic life and constantly suspected of encouraging excess. Flirtation thrived in the steamy air. Glances lingered. Compliments slipped out more easily when everyone was naked and warm. Even when men and women bathed separately, the proximity alone fueled imagination. Walls did little to contain desire. Gossip crossed them effortlessly. Moralists complained that the baths encouraged vanity, lust, and idle behavior, which in Roman thinking were gateways to social decay. Mixed bathing, when it occurred, caused particular outrage. Traditionalists saw it as a breakdown of discipline. Supporters framed it as harmless modernity. The debate was less about actual behavior and more about control. Who was allowed access to whose body and under what circumstances mattered deeply in a society obsessed with hierarchy. Philosophers weighed in with predictable discomfort. Some argued that the baths softened men, making them less suited for hardship and war. Others warned that constant pleasure eroded virtue. Yet few of these critics gave up bathing themselves. Condemnation rarely led to abstinence. The baths were too useful, too ingrained, too popular to abandon. Authorities responded with rules that were enforced unevenly. Certain behaviors were discouraged publicly and tolerated privately. This selective enforcement maintained the appearance of order without disrupting daily life. Rome specialized in this balance. Moral panic was allowed as long as it did not interfere with routine. The baths also exposed contradictions in Roman values. Strength and restraint were celebrated, yet indulgence was built into daily practice. Discipline was praised, yet leisure was institutionalized. The baths sat at the intersection of these conflicting ideals, making them both beloved and suspect. For many Romans, the appeal lay precisely in this ambiguity. The baths offer a controlled space where boundaries could be tested without openly breaking them. One could flirt without committing, relax without drawing, observe without acting. It was social freedom within acceptable limits. This tension never fully resolved. The baths remained places of pleasure, shadowed by judgment. They reflected Rome's ongoing struggle to reconcile desire with discipline. And in that struggle, the baths did not corrupt Roman society. They simply revealed it. For all their grandeur, Roman baths were not equally experienced by everyone. Entry was cheap, sometimes even free, but equality stopped at the door. The baths reflected Roman society as it was, not as it claimed to be. They welcomed the masses while quietly reinforcing who mattered most. Freeborn men enjoyed the greatest freedom. They moved confidently, spoke openly, and occupied central spaces without apology. Freed men followed close behind, eager to be seen participating fully in Roman life. Bathing was one of the clearest markers that someone belonged. To bathe publicly was to signal acceptance of Roman customs, values, and rhythms. The baths helped turn former outsiders into Romans, at least on the surface. Slaves, however, inhabited a strange in-between. Many attended the baths as attendants rather than theirs, carrying oils, towels, and scrapers. They heard conversations, but could not join them. Their presence was essential, yet invisible. Some slaves were allowed to bathe during off hours, but this was a privilege, not a right. Even in leisure spaces, hierarchy remained intact. Women's access varied widely across time and place. Some bathhouses had separate facilities or designated hours. Others offered mixed bathing, sparking controversy. Elite women navigated these spaces carefully, balancing visibility with reputation. Too much presence invited gossip. Too little suggested withdrawal from society. For lower status women, the baths offered rare access to communal space, but also exposure to judgment. Children and the elderly attended as well, each navigating expectations. Children learned social norms early, observing how bodies were judged and behavior monitored. The elderly, though respected, were often sidelined. Their presence reminded others of decline, something Roman culture preferred to keep distant. The baths also excluded by timing. Not everyone could attend during peak hours. Laborers came late or early. The elite arrived when it suited them. Time itself became a marker of status. Who bathed when mattered almost as much as who bathed where. Despite these divisions, the baths created a shared civic rhythm. People from different backgrounds crossed paths daily. Even brief proximity fostered familiarity. Rome relied on this. Shared spaces softened tensions without eliminating inequality. The baths were inclusive enough to unify, exclusive enough to control. They offered access while preserving order. In doing so, they became one of Rome's most effective tools for maintaining social cohesion, not by erasing hierarchy, but by normalizing it through daily routine. Roman baths endured because they solved multiple problems at once. They cleaned bodies just enough, entertained minds constantly, and kept people talking in spaces the state could quietly monitor. This combination made them far more than leisure facilities. They were instruments of stability, disguised as comfort. By bringing citizens together daily, the baths softened class tension without eliminating hierarchy. Everyone shared heat and water, but not influence. That balance mattered. A society where people never mix becomes brittle. A society where differences vanish becomes unstable. The BS maintained the illusion of unity while preserving structure. Rome excelled at this kind of compromise. They also trained Romans in public behavior. How to speak casually without revealing too much. How to listen without reacting. How to navigate desire, rivalry, and ambition under watchful eyes. These were not taught formally. They were absorbed through repetition. The baths were classrooms without lectures where social survival skills were practiced daily. Even gossip served a function. Rumors allowed tension to vent harmlessly before boiling over. Complaints could circulate without turning into rebellion. Ambitions could be tested quietly. Information flowed constantly, giving Rome a sense of itself in real time. The BS acted as a civic nervous system, transmitting signals long before crisis became visible. As the empire evolved, baths multiplied across provinces. They carried Roman habits, values, and expectations into new territories. To build baths was to announce civilization. To use them was to participate in it. Local elites adopted bath culture eagerly, understanding its social advantages. The baths became tools of cultural assimilation, making Rome feel familiar, even far from the capital. Over time, other institutions changed. Politics shifted. Religions rose and fell. But the bathhouse endured longer than most, precisely because it met everyday needs. People might disagree about laws or gods, but everyone liked warm water, conversation, and being seen. In the end, Roman baths mattered not because they were clean, but because they were connective. They bound individuals into routines, habits, and shared spaces. They made Rome feel present in daily life, not just in monuments or armies. When the baths eventually fell silent, something larger had changed. Not just infrastructure, but the social glue that held public life together. The steam faded, the gossip stopped, and Rome lost one of its most subtle sources of power. Cleanliness was optional, conversation was not, and it was conversation echoing off marble walls that kept Roman society flowing for centuries. Kaden were not stories told casually to pass the time. In Edo, Japan, they were experiences carefully staged to unsettle both the mind and the spirit. These ghost tales were often shared at night in quiet rooms lit only by candles when the boundary between the visible and the unseen felt thinnest. The most famous format was the Hayaka Monogatari Kaidangai, the gathering of 100 ghost stories. With each tale, a candle was extinguished. As the room grew darker, fear was expected to grow stronger. This was not about cheap thrills. Kaden were rooted in the belief that stories had power. Words could summon attention from the spirit world. Silence, darkness, and anticipation mattered as much as the tale itself. By the final story, the room was meant to be nearly black, forcing listeners to confront their own imagination. If something appeared in the darkness, it was unclear whether it came from the story or from somewhere else entirely. A due society was orderly on the surface. Rules governed class, behavior, clothing, and movement. Kaden offered a controlled way to explore what lay beneath that order. They allowed people to speak about violence, betrayal, and injustice without directly challenging authority. A ghost could say what a living person could not. Fear became a socially acceptable outlet. These stories were deeply shaped by Buddhist ideas of karma and attachment. Spirits did not usually return because they were evil. They returned because something had gone terribly unresolved. Rage, jealousy, grief, or betrayal bound them to the world of the living. In Kaden, the afterlife was not a clean separation. It was messy, emotional, and unfinished. The setting mattered. Thin paper walls creaked. Wind moved shadows. A distant sound could become part of the story. Listeners were not passive. They were participants holding their breath, scanning corners of the room, feeling the weight of each extinguished flame. Fear was communal, shared, and deliberately cultivated. Kaden thrived in a culture that believed spirits were everywhere. Roads, rivers, bridges, abandoned houses. The world was layered and humans occupied only one level of it. These stories reminded people to behave carefully, treat others justly, and respect unseen consequences. Not because morality was abstract, but because punishment might follow you beyond death. By the time the last candle went out, the room was silent. No one laughed. The stories were over, but the fear lingered. That lingering feeling was the point. Kaiden were meant to follow you home. At the center of Edo period Kaiden stands the Enryo, the most feared type of ghost in Japanese folklore. These spirits were not born monsters. They were created by injustice. An Enryo was a human being who suffered so deeply in life that death did not loosen their grip on the world. Betrayal, humiliation, abandonment, or abuse became emotional chains strong enough to anchor the soul among the living. What made Enryo terrifying was not their appearance alone, but their moral logic. They did not haunt randomly. They returned with purpose. In Buddhist thought, intense attachment and unresolved emotion could warp the soul, preventing rebirth. Rage, especially, was seen as corrosive. When carried into death, it transformed grief into something dangerous. The Enryo was not evil by nature. It was unfinished. Many Enryo stories focused on women, reflecting the rigid constraints of Edo society. Women had limited legal power and were often trapped in abusive marriages, discarded by lovers, or punished for transgressions. Men escaped freely. In life, silence was expected. In death, that silence broke violently. The ghost became a voice that could no longer be ignored. Enryo were often described with visual restraint that made them more unsettling. Long black hair hanging loose, pale skin, white burial robes, a face frozen between sorrow and fury. These were not dramatic monsters. They were familiar figures twisted slightly out of place. Recognition was part of the horror. The ghost was someone you should have protected. Their vengeance was rarely targeted neatly, and Enryo's anger spilled outward, harming not just the guilty, but anyone nearby. This reflected a deeper fear. Injustice poisons everything it touches. In many stories, entire households or villages suffer because one wrong was left unrest. The supernatural punishment mirrors social consequence. Importantly, Enryo could not be defeated through strength. Swords were useless. Authority meant nothing. The only way to stop them was acknowledgement, apology, prayer, ritual. The living had to admit wrongdoing and restore moral balance. Fear alone accomplished nothing. These stories carried a warning. Suppressed cruelty does not disappear. It accumulates. Edo audiences understood this instinctively. The Enryo was not just a ghost. It was a reminder that emotional violence carried consequences beyond law and lifetime. In Kaiden, rage was immortal, and that made the Enryo the most honest ghost of all. Although the Edo period is often remembered as an age of peace, it rested on the memory and machinery of violence. Samurai still carried swords. Honor still demanded blood. Executions were public. Punishment was severe. And behind the calm surface of order lay centuries of killing that had never fully settled. Kaiden absorbed this history and gave it shape in the spirit world. Many ghost stories revolve around samurai who abuse power or fail their obligations. A lord who discarded a loyal retainer. A warrior who killed unjustly. A duel that ended in treachery rather than honor. These acts did not simply vanish once the sword was cleaned. In Kaiden logic, violent imbalance left residue. Spirits lingered where justice had not been satisfied. Samurai ghosts were often portrayed differently from Enryo. Their rage was colder, heavier. They appeared bound to specific locations, bridges, gates, crossroads, or execution grounds, places where blood had soaked into memory. These spirits did not scream or lash out wildly. They waited. Their presence was felt rather than seen, like pressure in the air. The fear here was not of chaos, but of obligation. Samurai culture emphasized loyalty, hierarchy, and duty above all else. Failing those principles carried consequences even beyond death. A ghost might return not to seek revenge, but to reenact unfinished duty, guarding a bridge forever, challenging passers-by, repeating a final moment endlessly. Kaiden used these figures to question the moral cost of violence wrapped in ceremony. Killing in the name of honor did not always produce peace. Sometimes it produced haunting. The story suggested that ritualized violence still wounded the soul, even when socially justified. Common people listened carefully to these tales. Samurai authority was absolute in life. Ghost stories were one of the few spaces where that authority could be quietly challenged. A cruel lord might escape punishment while alive, but death leveled the hierarchy. In the spirit world, rank offered no protection. Buddhist influence shaped these narratives deeply. Violence created karmic weight. That weight had to go somewhere. If it was not resolved through repentance or ritual, it lingered. Hauntings were not supernatural anomalies. They were consequences. Through samurai ghosts, Caden reminded listeners that peace enforced by the sword was fragile. Beneath polite order lay unresolved bloodshed, waiting to surface. The spirits were not interruptions of history. They were history refusing to stay buried. Not all Edo period ghosts returned in rage or armor. Some arrived quietly, almost gently, and that subtlety made them far more disturbing. Among the most unsettling figures in Caden were the faceless women, spirits who appeared normal at first glance and only revealed their absence of identity at the final moment. These stories relied less on violence and more on the collapse of expectation. A traveler might meet a woman on a dark road. She would speak politely, perhaps ask for directions, perhaps warn of danger ahead. Nothing seemed wrong. Only when the listener looked closer would the illusion break. Where her face should be, there was nothing. Smooth skin, blank emptiness. No eyes, no mouth, no expression. The horror came not from what she did, but from what was missing. These ghosts reflected a deep anxiety within Adu society. Identity was tightly bound to social role. Woman, wife, daughter, servant. To lose one's place was to risk becoming invisible. Faceless ghosts embodied erasure. They were spirits stripped of recognition, reduced to presence without personhood. In some versions, the faceless woman was a victim of abandonment or neglect. In others, she represented the fear of urban anonymity. Edo cities were growing rapidly. People moved, disappeared, reinvented themselves. Caden transformed that unease in a supernatural form. The ghost without a face was the ultimate stranger, familiar enough to approach, empty enough to terrify. These spirits rarely attacked. Instead, they unsettled. Witnesses fled in panic, questioning their own perception. The fear lingered because there was no clear threat to resolve, no curse to break, no vengeance to appease. The encounter ended, but the doubt remained. Transformation played a major role in these stories. Ghosts shifted shape. Women became mist. Faces melted away. Bodies flickered like lantern light. This instability reflected a Buddhist view of impermanence taken to its extreme. Identity itself was fragile. Attachment to form led to suffering. Faceless ghosts also serve as warnings about attention and awareness. In many tales, those who ignored small signs were the ones most deeply shaken. The ghost did not deceive through force. It relied on assumption. The listener believed they were seeing a person. That belief was the trap. Unlike vengeful spirits, these ghosts did not demand justice. They demanded recognition. Their horror lay in confronting the possibility that someone could exist without being truly seen. In Edo, Japan, where social order depended on knowing one's place, that idea was deeply unsettling. The faceless woman did not scream. She did not chase. She simply revealed absence. And in doing so, she left listeners questioning how solid identity truly was once the candle light went out. Underlying nearly every Caden is the logic of karma. Ghosts did not appear because the world was random or cruel. They appeared because something remained unresolved. Adu audiences understood this instinctively. A haunting was not an accident. It was the visible result of imbalance. The universe insisting on being corrected. In Buddhist thinking, death did not erase responsibility. Actions clung to the soul. Desire, resentment, jealousy, and guilt weighed heavily, pulling spirits back toward the world they were supposed to leave behind. Caden made this invisible process tangible. A curse was not magic for its own sake. It was consequence wearing a frightening shape. Many stories follow a similar pattern. Someone commits a wrong, often small at first. A promise broken, a servant mistreated, a lover discarded. At the time, nothing seems to happen. Life continues. Then gradually, strange events begin. Sounds at night, repeated dreams, a feeling of being watched. The ghost arrives late, but inevitably. What makes these stories unsettling is how ordinary the causes are. Caden do not focus on grand villains. They focus on everyday cruelty. The message is clear. You do not need to be monstrous to create a haunting. You only need to be careless with another human life. Curses in Caden are rarely limited to one target. Like emotional trauma, they spread outward. A household suffers. Children fall ill. Servants flee. Innocent bystanders are affected. This reflects a belief that wrongdoing poisons its environment. Harm does not stay contained. Resolution, when it comes, is never simple. The ghost cannot usually be destroyed. Appeasement is required. Prayers, apologies, memorial rites. The living must acknowledge what they would rather forget. Only then can the spirit loosen its grip. Ignoring the problem only strengthens it. This moral framework made Caden deeply effective. Fear was not arbitrary. It was instructional. Listeners left with more than chills. They left with a heightened awareness of responsibility. Treat people carefully. Honor promises. Resolve conflict while you are alive. Otherwise, it may follow you. Caden transformed abstract religious concepts into emotional experiences. Karma was no longer a philosophical idea. It was a pale figure at the edge of your vision, waiting patiently. The story suggested that the dead were not gone. They were watching, remembering, and waiting for balance to be restored. In Edo, Japan, this belief was not fringe superstition. It shaped behavior. Ghost stories taught ethics without sermons. And in the quiet after the final candle went out, listeners understood the lesson clearly. Some deaths do not end with death. In Edo Kaiden, ghosts are rarely abstract. They are tied to locations. A bridge where someone was betrayed. A well where a body was hidden. A house where cruelty became routine. These places are not just backdrops. They are participants. Space itself absorbs memory, and memory makes certain ground dangerous to walk on. Listeners in Edo, Japan were acutely aware of this idea. Cities were layered with history, often violent, often unspoken. Execution grounds sat just beyond city limits. Old estates passed between families, carrying stories no one wanted to inherit. Roads were walked by thousands, but some footsteps lingered longer than others. Caden gave form to the suspicion that places could remember what people try to forget. Many stories begin innocently. A traveler seeks shelter for the night. A family moves into a new home. A shortcut is taken across a bridge at dusk. The setting feels ordinary until it is not. A chill, an echo, a repetition of sound. The location reveals its past slowly, as if testing whether the living are paying attention. This focus on place reflects a broader Edo worldview. The boundary between human life and the spirit world was not distant. It ran through everyday spaces. Shrines stood at crossroads. Small offerings were left at trees or stones. Respecting place was part of social etiquette. Ignoring it invited trouble. Haunted locations also reinforced social memory. A bridge haunted by a betrayed samurai reminded listeners of loyalty. A well haunted by a murdered servant warned against abuse. These stories preserved moral lessons in geography. Even if names were forgotten, the place endured as a warning. Importantly, these locations were not always avoided. People continued to cross the bridge, live in the house, draw water from the well. Fear existed alongside necessity. This tension made the stories more believable. Life did not stop because of ghosts. It adapted cautiously. In some tales, the haunting fades when the place is acknowledged properly. A memorial is built. Prayers are offered. The story is told openly. Silence, not presence, is what feeds the ghost. When a place's history is recognized, the spirit loosens its hold. Caden taught listeners to move carefully through the world. Not because danger was everywhere, but because meaning was. Every path carried echoes. Every structure had a past. The living shared space with what came before them, whether they admitted it or not. In Edo, Japan, haunted places were not warnings to flee. They were reminders to remember. By the Edo period, Caden were no longer confined to private candlelit gatherings. They became a form of popular entertainment, circulating through books, theater, and public storytelling events. Illustrated collections of ghost tales sold widely, their images lingering in the mind long after the page was turned. Kabuki plays adapted famous hauntings, transforming fear into spectacle. And yet, even as Caden became more accessible, they never lost their seriousness. People did not listen to ghost stories simply to be frightened. Fear served a purpose. It sharpened attention. It reinforced memory. A lesson wrapped in terror stayed with you longer than one delivered calmly. Edito audiences understood this intuitively. Caden were thrilling, but they were also instructional, shaping behavior through emotional impact. Many stories followed a familiar structure. A wrong is committed. Life continues as if nothing happened. Then consequences arrive slowly, inevitably. This pattern mirrored real life, more closely than moral sermons ever could. Injustice often goes unpunished in a moment. Guilt lingers quietly. Caden acknowledged this uncomfortable truth, then carried it one step further. If justice failed in life, it would not fail forever. Children heard these stories, too, though often softened. The message was still clear. Be careful how you treat others. Respect the dead. Mind your promises. Fear taught restraint where authority could not always reach. In a society built on order, Caden reinforced boundaries without requiring constant enforcement. Entertainment also provided distance. By framing fear as story, people could explore it safely. They could confront death, betrayal, and violence without experiencing them directly. This made Caden emotionally useful. They allowed listeners to rehearse anxiety, grief, and moral doubt in controlled settings. Importantly, Caden rarely ended with triumph. There was no heroic victory over evil. Resolution came through acknowledgement, ritual, or acceptance. Sometimes it did not come at all. This lack of closure distinguished Caden from simple horror. The unease lingered intentionally, encouraging reflection rather than relief. As ghost stories spread through Edito culture, they became shared reference points. Everyone knew certain tales. Mentioning a haunted bridge or vengeful spirit carried meaning instantly. Fear became communal knowledge, binding people together through shared imagination. In this way, Caden balanced pleasure and discipline. They entertained while reinforcing values. They frightened while teaching caution. Edo Japan did not see these functions as contradictory. Fear, when shaped by story, was a tool, and Caden wielded it carefully, ensuring that long after the performance ended, listeners carried the lesson home with them in the dark. As Edo Japan gave way to modernization, Caden did not disappear. They adapted. The candle-lit rooms faded, but the stories found new vessels. Printed collections preserved classic hauntings. Woodblock prints fixed ghostly images into the public imagination. Later, film and literature carried Caden into entirely new eras, proving that the fear they evoked was not tied to time or place. What changed was not the ghosts, but the audience. As society modernized, belief in spirits shifted from certainty to suspicion. Yet, Caden remained effective precisely because they never depended on literal belief. You did not need to believe in ghosts to feel the unease they created. The stories spoke to emotional truths that remained intact. Guilt, loss, injustice, and the fear of consequences that arrived too late. Modern Japanese horror inherited Caden's structure almost intact. Vengeful spirits still return because of unresolved wrongs. Women wronged by society still haunt the living. Places still remember what happened there. Even when the setting becomes urban apartments or empty subways, the logic remains the same. Something was ignored. Now it demands attention. What makes Caden so durable is their restraint. They rarely rely on shock alone. Horror unfolds slowly. The supernatural intrudes quietly. Silence matters. Absence matters. This pacing influences modern storytelling far beyond Japan, shaping global horror aesthetics that favor atmosphere over spectacle. Caden also resists simple moral resolution. Modern audiences are accustomed to clear villains and victories. Caden deny that comfort. The ghost is often justified. The living are often complicit. Resolution, when it occurs, feels incomplete. This ambiguity feels increasingly relevant in a world where harm is complex and accountability often delayed. Even skepticism does not weaken Caden. In some ways, it strengthens them. When ghosts are no longer accepted as literal, they become metaphors. Trauma that refuses to fade. History that will not stay buried. Social wounds passed quietly between generations. The haunting becomes psychological, but no less powerful. Japanese culture continues to revisit kaiden because they offer a language for discussing what is difficult to confront directly. Modern horror, literature, and art still return to these themes, reshaping them for new anxieties while preserving their emotional core. The candle may be gone, the room may be bright, but the fear remains. Kaiden survived Edo Japan because they were never about darkness alone. They were about what happens when people believe the past is finished and discover instead that it has been waiting patiently for the lights to go out. Kaiden endure because they refuse to let the living forget. At their core, these stories insist that actions matter beyond their immediate moment. They reject the idea that time alone heals injustice. In Edo, Japan, this belief shaped how people understood responsibility, memory, and fear. And it continues to resonate because those concerns have never disappeared. The ghosts of kaiden are not invaders from another world. They are consequences. They return because something was denied recognition while it could still be addressed. An apology never offered, a cruelty dismissed, a promise broken and rationalized away. Kaiden suggests that ignoring harm does not erase it, it transforms it. What makes these stories powerful is their refusal to comfort. There is no final authority that restores order effortlessly. Priests struggle. Rituals fail. Sometimes the haunting simply fades, not because justice was achieved, but because enough acknowledgement finally occurred. Closure, when it arrives, is fragile and incomplete. That uncertainty feels honest. Kaiden also invert the usual relationship between fear and power. The living often holds social authority. The dead hold moral authority. A samurai may command obedience in life, but in death he may be judged by the very people he once controlled. A woman silenced in life may speak most loudly after death. These reversals allow kaiden to challenge hierarchy without confronting it directly. Importantly, kaiden do not encourage paranoia. They do not claim danger lurks everywhere. Instead, they teach attentiveness. Pay attention to how you treat others. Pay attention to places, promises, and silence. Harm does not need to be dramatic to be lasting. Small acts left unresolved can echo far longer than expected. In Edo, Japan, these stories functioned as quiet, ethical reminders woven into entertainment. They shaped behavior without preaching. Fear did the work that instruction could not. By lingering the mind, kaiden guided people long after the story ended. Today, kaiden remain relevant because they address the same human tendencies: avoidance, rationalization, forgetting. They ask uncomfortable questions without offering easy answers. What do we owe those we wrong? What happens when we move on too quickly? What voices are we ignoring because acknowledging them would require change? The dead and kaiden still speak because the living still listen, not for proof of ghosts, but for recognition of responsibility. These stories survive not as relics of superstition, but as reminders that some things do not disappear simply because we stop looking at them. When the lights go out, they're still there, waiting to be acknowledged.